So I'm Doug Zeeman, retired engineer, 41 years continuous service with GC Marconi and its successive companies.
A long and, shall we say, illustrious history?
You could say that.
Where are you now? Where could you be now? What is exactly all the contraptions behind you, Doug?
Well, the contraptions behind me are to do with the radio room on the Titanic, or it's a replica of the Titanic radio room. I was a radio officer with Marconi International Marine Company. Head office was in Chelmsford, and I was a radio officer with them for 5.5 years.
So that's a replica of the Titanic radio room.
Yes, it is. Slightly different equipment to what I would have been used to in the 1970s, but it was the same arrangement with the Marconi International Marine Company. Marconi International Marine Company, the contract with the shipping companies and with the Titanic would have been White Star. There would have been a situation where the radio equipment would have been rented to the company. The radio officer would have been seconded to the shipping company, but an employee of Marconi International Marine Company Limited. And there would have been a contract drawn up to allow the radio officer not only to operate and keep maintained the equipment that he had, but also the commercial side of the company, which was to send and receive traffic for those on board the ship. Traffic being the radio communications, the messages, the telegrams.
How improved was the radio equipment on board ships compared to the one behind you at Titanic?
Okay.
Presumably greatly.
Greatly. There were a number of lessons learned from the Titanic disaster. The majority of those lessons were associated with safety of life at sea, and equipment in the radio room was greatly modified. We had an automatic alarm system that listened for the SOS distress signals in the vicinity of the ship. So if I wasn't on watch and I was in my cabin, asleep or otherwise, then it was a case of the alarm bell would ring and I would go up to the radio room immediately, well, as soon as I could, to listen to the message that the automatic alarm was receiving. So that was one of the biggest improvements, very, very important improvement. The other thing was that the radio room of the Titanic was a 5 kilowatt radio transmitter. The 5 kilowatts, one of the issues with the contract that Marconi International Marine Company had with White Star was that they had to guarantee 350 miles range for messages to be sent and received. So the thought at that time was that they needed 5 kilowatts. With modern technology, and certainly in the 1970s when I was at sea, you didn't need that power, and also you could choose your frequency at various times of the day and modify the range to which you could actually send and receive messages.
That's right, because as I understand it, they discovered very early on that at night something happens to the airwaves and messages can double, triple the distance, whereas during the day they didn't. What's that phenomenon?
Well, it's a propagation phenomenon, and the ionospheric conditions change. There are certain layers of the ionosphere that change their depth during the night compared with the day, and it allows radio signals to be during the night. You can use quite low frequency to get a very long way, whereas during the day the frequencies are much higher, but you can use skip skip propagation to get those signals to where you want them to be.
Back in the day of the Titanic, the world wasn't jammed with 1,000 radio messages. So if the Titanic was picking up and sending signals across the globe, it didn't really matter because there was nobody there to hear them. but at your time, you didn't want to be sending things that could be picked up in America 1,000, 2,000 miles away. Am I right?
That's correct. Also, the bandwidth that the transmitted messages would be sent, the bandwidth, meaning the range, if you like, on the radio dial that you could actually hear a particular signal, the bandwidth would have been enormous on the type of transmitter that we're talking about. That's example behind me. The transmission would have been very, very noisy indeed, and any ships nearby would have certainly heard the signals. What we did with the latest technology in the 1970s, we used much reduced bandwidth, but the signal had a lot more efficiency.
It was targeted.
It was targeted.
Now you're holding there a most precious replica. Tell us a bit about that hat.
Right, well, the Marconi International Marine Company operators, they were employed by Marconi International Marine. The operators were seconded, if you like, or lent or loaned to the White Star Line. So their uniform had to carry, or needed to carry, the emblem of the great Marconi Company, and that's what you see here on the front of the cap.
So that they could be distinguishable from White Star Line officers.
That's correct.
And it would give them a certain gravitas when they promenaded wearing that hat.
That is true.
How many Marconi Marine operators were on the Titanic, and how many would have been on ships in your era?
Right. On the Titanic, there were only two wireless operators, they were called, on there. The senior wireless operator was Jack Phillips. The junior wireless operator was Harold Bride. Both of these gentlemen would have kept watches. The watches were decided upon depending on the conditions that the ship was involved in commercially. So if the passengers were up and about, there would be a lot of messages that the passengers wanted to send.
So we're not talking 24/7 coverage. They didn't do it on rotation, really.
No.
So there could have been a time when both of them were fast asleep, and there wasn't any automatic alarm. If another ship had gone down,
correct,
even with two operators,
there would have
missed it.
There would have been dead times.
Dead times.
Without the radio, without that automatic alarm that I explained about, then there would have been times where both operators would have been in their cabins.
So we're looking perhaps after 1 o'clock and to about 6 o'clock in the morning, perhaps.
Perhaps, yeah. So of course, if there were problems on the ship or associated with problems associated with ships in the area, and the officer of the watch recognised that on the bridge, then he would make sure that the radio officers were woken up and were brought to the radio rooms. But the radio room would have been unmanned for a certain amount of the time during the night.
When you were on board, presumably you were on merchant ships.
Yes.
When you were aboard your merchant ships, how did the size compare with the Titanic? Were they pretty much smaller?
Well, I served on a number of different ships. I started off on general cargo, I went to container ships, and I went to passenger liners. I was actually on the Shore Savile Ocean Monarch, which was a fairly well had a lot of history. She was originally in Canadian Pacific, and she was built in the 1950s. So those were in my sort of first year at sea. And then I moved on to super tankers. So I was actually with Texaco tank ship, and I was on some of the world's largest tankers. So 275,000 tonnes was a typical example. That was Texaco, London.
We're talking about ships that take a couple of miles to stop.
Correct. And these ships would have dwarfed Titanic.
And could they have survived a iceberg? Did you ever see icebergs in your voyages?
Well, supertankers don't normally go into ice-infested waters.
Well, nor do liners, actually.
No, but I was on a cargo ship. We were the last cargo ship to leave the Hudson Bay in 1975. I think it was the start of the ice season, so it would have been the start of winter in 1975. And we went to Churchill, which is the polar bear capital of Manitoba in Canada. But we were the last ship to leave Hudson Bay before she froze over for that season. So yes, I've seen icebergs. Yes, we had damage. Certainly the bow had quite a lot of damage, and we had to get it fixed when we were back in Birkenhead. But yes, it does happen even today on ships that ice damage does occur.
With your background with Marconi, one of your patron saints, as it were, martyrs in fact, would be Jack Phillips.
Yes.
Who gave his life, lost his life, whereas Harold Bride, by providence, escaped and was able to tell the story to two boards of inquiry as to what went wrong. How much did Marconi inculcate you with that story, or was it something which you couldn't mention because it was so awful? So did you read up about it? Did you watch films? Did you ever think at night, imagine yourself and think about what Jack Phillips and his colleague Harold Bride must have gone through?
Yes. I suppose all radio officers, because we were officers by the 1970s, we were officer status. So radio operators, or wireless operators as they were on Titanic, we became radio officers. And as an employee of Marconi International Marine Company and a radio officer, the history of the company was definitely something that most of us took interest in, and we were encouraged to take that interest. Certainly Harold Bride was a hero. It was quite clear that Jack Phillips maintained his station, as it were, right to the very last minute, and he was very, very, very much a very loyal employee of Marconi International Marine Company. He knew his position on the ship. He knew that the only time that he could leave his station was when he was dismissed by the captain.
Even then he stayed. Even then, I wonder, was it when the electricity went off that he moved?
That's right, when the power failed completely.
And we're talking about water that must have been lapping around his feet.
Probably up to his knees at one stage. Yes, I mean the batteries eventually gave out because there was battery backup for all the radio equipment.
Not connected to the power of the ship. It was actually battery backup.
Yes, when the mains failed on board the ship, there was an emergency transmitter which could be used on batteries.
So just like a modern ship.
Yes, and those batteries, of course, do have a finite life. And in those days, the battery power required for the transmitter, even the emergency transmitter, was quite high. So that unfortunately, there was a time when eventually the battery power wasn't there, and the transmitter wouldn't work anymore, and that signalled gave Jack as far as he was concerned, he had to leave.
12:36 in the wireless room of the Titanic, Operator Phillips received his first encouragement.
She's 58 miles away, sir. And she says she's coming hard. 58 miles. They'll be too late.
Still on board, Operator Phillips, Operator Bride, Captain Smith.
Spark is weak.
And you have done your full duty. You can do no more. Abandon your cabin. It's every man for himself now.
There's still a little power left, sir.
So, look out for yourselves.
Captain Smith had already been to him and said, "You can go," but he, as you say, he stayed until the very last minute. Unfortunately, on trying to get him, Captain Smith had already been to him and said, "You can go," but he, as you say, he stayed until the very last minute. Unfortunately, on trying to get into one of the lifeboats, he wasn't able to. He didn't have the strength. Harold did, and he was picked up by Carpathia. When he arrived on Carpathia, he went up he got on up to the radio room, and he relieved the wireless operator of the Carpathia.
Despite, was it frostbite?
Despite having he had very severe frostbite in both feet. When they docked in New York, they actually had to get him off the ship because he wanted to just stay where he was and give an account of what things were before anything else. But he needed rest, and they actually managed to get him. They convinced him to leave the ship.
Amazingly, the boss was there to meet him on the gangplank.
Yes, he was.
It turned Marconi into perhaps the world's first superhero. He was feted, dear Marconi Hall Street.
Yes.
It was flooded with orders. They built New Street, and the rest is history. Chelmsford, as we know, is, well, we could say Radio City, or is it Wireless City?
Well, it's more properly, it's the birthplace of wireless, but Chelmsford is definitely the town, or was the town there then, and all the equipment in the Titanic radio room, together with the battery box, remembering that the batteries were the power supply, the emergency power supply. The battery box and everything else associated with the radio station would have been produced at Hall Street.
You must be very proud of Marconi's historic link with liners and your career with Marconi. It has kudos.
One thing which the radio officer, even in the 1970s, was encouraged to do was to be very much an independent person. In other words, you did not have a boss apart from the captain. You were your own boss as far as maintaining and operating the equipment was concerned. If you were on a passenger liner, obviously there were more than the juniors and the senior radio officer. You often had a chief, two second radio officers, and at least one junior. But the issue is that the radio officer, even in the 1970s, was very, very much left on his own to in effect become independent, and in doing that you became an extremely confident individual. And that certainly, when I came ashore, and my 4 careers after that, 4 career strands, even within the same company, stood me in good stead. The fact that I had that independent.
It must have been a bit lonely.
One thing that the radio officer obviously did, even in the 1970s, was to transmit radio telegrams, to set up phone calls from the crew and passengers to home. And those telegrams and radio telephone calls did require an amount of, not salesmanship, but you had to, because you were working for Marconi Marine, and one of the issues about your particular position on the ship was to make money for the company. Then you were involved in a commercial enterprise, and you became very popular with crew and officers. So I did say that it helped me in my future career moves. What I did was I came ashore, I became an engineer ashore. I then went into sales engineering, into quality engineering, and latterly, before I retired, I was a contracts manager at BAE Systems at Great Baddow in Chelmsford. Now, all of the acumen, I guess, the requirement to be precise and to be very accurate in all my dealings, all stemmed from the original career I had.
So all those years disciplined you?
Discipline, yeah.
Discipline was the key. Were you pleased to wave goodbye to ships? Because they can sink.
I still find myself in, if I have an opportunity to go on things like Balmoral or any of the paddle steamers, Waverley, anything that's going, I'll make a point of going on board because I love old ships particularly. But I do have, when I go down to the coast, I'm very, very active with the Royal National Lifeboat Institution.
Do you support any particular RNLI stations or just generally RNLI?
I am an education volunteer with the Royal National Lifeboat Institution for the Chelmsford area.
What does that involve?
It involves going into schools and youth groups and talking about safety in open water, whether it be rivers, lakes, the sea, you name it.
So you're an evangelist?
I'm an evangelist. Yes, you could
Telling
say
them,
that.
be careful,
Be
or else you
careful,
could
or
lose
else.
your life.
Yes.
What would you say in the light of the recent lad who went off and drifted out into the Irish Sea, carried away on his surf?
He did observe all the good things that a surfer needs to do. He didn't leave the surfboard. He didn't try and swim against the tide. He knew, as he had been taught, that he had to
Respect the
sea. And in doing that, he did very well because he had the right kit. He was very well insulated, and because he left, he didn't leave his surfboard. The surfboard was quite brightly coloured, and they saw him eventually. And miraculously, after so many hours being in open water, he survived. But it's good that he did observe the lessons that he would have been taught.
Well, what rules and lessons do you like imparting on people then?
We had a situation in this region, where there was a number of people who got caught up in a riptide. What we're always taught with the RNLI is that you do not try and swim against a riptide. You follow the line of the shore, and you let it effectively transport you.
You go for a ride, as it were, like on a surf ride.
Don't try and fight against it, because you will never. The elements are so, weather and the elements, the nature's elements are much greater than you might imagine.
So you've still got one foot on board through your work with the RNLI.
Yeah.
What are you actually doing here at the Titanic exhibition, Doug?
I did volunteer, and it was an interesting story again. But here we go. I've been a member of the Civic Society for 2 weeks, and I've been as active as I can be in providing a volunteer role here at the exhibition.
Have you met any interesting people?
I certainly have, including my interviewer.
Of course, we go back a few years.
Yes, and interestingly, some of the folk that I have met within the Civic Society are folk that have got common interests with me.
It must warm the cockles of your heart to see a wireless deck.
Yes, obviously it's
but not in these circumstances, perhaps.
Yes, it's somewhat older than what my days were, but it's very well preserved, very well authenticated, and the exhibition is one of the one of the finest really for the space that they've got.